Welcome, everybody, to the Centre for Science and Policy annual lecture. I'm Rob Doubleday, Director of the Centre for Science and Policy. This is our annual occasion to gather people together in Cambridge. And one of the things we like to do is thank you all very much for giving time to meet the various policymakers that the Centre for Science and Policy brings to Cambridge. We were set up 10 years ago to try and improve the quality of public policy making by increasing the use of evidence and expertise in the policy making process. One of the main ways we do that is bringing people with really interesting policy questions, people who are working sort of in government or in other organizations, asking them to put down their questions and then bringing them to Cambridge and connecting them to experts from lots of different disciplines, from inside the university, from outside the university, to give them space, time, stimulation to think hard, to think about the interconnections, the problems they're working on, think about the long time scales in which the problems they're working on are going to play out. And that's only possible because people give their time to meet these policymakers. So since we've been doing this, we've had 10,155 of these one-to-one meetings, so thank you very much for that. So as I said, I mean, that's our aim, and so there can be, I think, no one better to deliver this annual lecture than Dame Sally Davies, who needs no introduction, so of course now I'm going to give you a quick introduction. Dame Sally trained as a medic in Manchester. This is going to be the short version. Practiced as a hematologist in London, and then did lots of wonderful things. And then in 2004, joined the Department of Health as the Chief Scientific Advisor and Director General for Research and Development. Again, did many wonderful things, but just to pick out one that I know has really made a lasting difference to research, medical and health research in this country, is established the NIHR, National Institute for Health Research. Then in 2010, was appointed Chief Medical Officer, and held that post until just last summer when Dame Sally, to our delight, arrived in Cambridge as the Master of Trinity College. So that's my introduction to Dame Sally. I actually I've been in the same room as her. She doesn't know this. I spent 1 year as a very lowly official working for the Government Chief Scientific Advisor in 2009. And many departments in the UK government have chief scientific advisors. They come together, they work together on problems. And as a lowly official in the back of the room, I can tell you that Dame Sally's contribution was always particularly valued. And I think her expertise was clearly recognized, but also her know-how, her practical sense of how to get stuff done. So that's what we've invited Sally to talk about. How to get evidence to inform policymaking. What's the sort of the high theory of how to do this, and what's the kind of the practical craft of getting the effective, getting evidence to effectively informed policy. So just before I move on, practical thing, this is being recorded, not live streamed, but recorded, and will go up on the CSaP website, so bear that in mind when it comes to Q&A. But now I would like to ask you to welcome Dame Sally Davies to give this year's lecture.
Thank you, Rob. So those of you who know me well will regret this is being filmed, because I am the mistress of the side comment that's both entertaining and probably quite instructive. But I will try and behave, because it's on celluloid. It's the first time I've been in St. John's, so I was later than I might have been because I was taking pictures of the lodge where I live, the Wren Library. It's a great pleasure to be here in Cambridge. I'm on a learning curve, not having been brought up in Cambridge in any way. But I did meet CSaP some years ago when I was invited to a discussion dinner on antimicrobial resistance. And for those of you who know me, you'll not be surprised that in the main I'm using that as the case study today. I do think that academia, scientists, researchers bring a lot to policy. But I suppose we all go on a journey. And you know, back in the 80s, we had the outbreak of evidence-based medicine. And I believe in evidence-based medicine. You have randomized controlled trials, you know what's right, and you should do it. But over the years, what we've learned is you have to temper the evidence with what does that individual need, what's their circumstances, what are their hopes, aspirations, what's doable. So evidence-based medicine's been on a journey. And I think too few academics understand that you can't always do evidence-based policy. You have to do evidence-informed policy. And actually, good ministers bring a lot to the evidence. I have many colleagues in this room, including former ministers. The best ministers, and two of them are here, for me, were the ones I could have an active debate with, indeed an argument, and sometimes lose it, James, but there you go. It's always good to lose an argument. So, as you heard, I was the 16th Chief Medical Officer, the first woman. I was the Chief Scientific Advisor. And what did I bring? I brought my knowledge as a doctor, my knowledge of up-to-date health evidence, and I wanted to support the government and help them get it right. And the role of Chief Medical Officer is very varied. It's an independent role. I'm not allied to any political party. It is to advise the government, all government, though I sat in health. I work a lot with the Development Agency, DFID, and with the Foreign Office, a bit with DEFRA and the others, to advise all of them on the problems. In the past, my predecessors did things like sewage, smoking bans. I was interested in the problems of today, vaccine refusal. Antibiotics were coming back to alcohol and its cost to society, even cannabis. I've done very many things. I also had a quite significant role in global health on behalf of Britain and our government, being on the executive board at the WHO and playing very many roles. So my role was to advise and support. And I quickly discovered the advantage of having ministers able to interrogate the policy and ask the questions that maybe hadn't been thought about. But one of the great pleasures of my role was actually that I had to statutorily produce an annual report on the state of the nation's health each year. So my predecessors had written monographs, but I wanted to make my USP evidence, and to be clear when the evidence was unclear, and clear when it was crystal and probably sorted. So I decided to do it differently and get the experts in the room on a subject that I chose, to debate it, then to write the chapters in a structured format, and then my role was to put together what did this mean for policy, and it seems to have worked very well. Though I was a bit pissed off when I, for reasons I've forgotten now, a week ago looked on Wikipedia and it implied I'd given up the role and contracted it out and didn't, at least that's how I read it, didn't know what I was doing. I think that it brought in real evidence and real quality to the role. And we brought together people from clinical, from basic science, and brought in the social sciences. Very important. And I got a junior doctor to help me, who worked in the field, do it, to try and make it work, and they learned a lot, as I did from them, of course. So I wanted to start with a report that I thought would be uncontestable. I thought infection goes from primary care to secondary care to intensive care. So we all have to cope with it, and it should be really easy. And so this was my first report. I still don't understand the dating, because it was a 2011 report that I produced in 2013. So don't ask me, I don't know. And one of the things that hit me when they came back, the experts with their chapters, and I'd read them all, it's a volume like that, was that things had changed since I stopped seeing patients directly in 2006. And in fact, what I said was, So antimicrobial resistance is getting worse. And they all said, well, yes, it's going up year on year. And I said, so what have you done about this? And they said, well, we've told people. This was the experts, and I think it's very interesting when you talk about evidence. How do you filter evidence so it's prioritized, the issues get through, and the people who need to hear it do something? And I was hearing the experts tell me that people were already dying, and because, as I'm going to show you, there's an empty pipeline, lots more were going to die. So by the time we'd finished that day, I said, oh, shit. I didn't know I was going to have to do this, but I will give you voice. And I started on a program of advocacy. And that, in a sense, is what I'm going to talk about today. I did make quite a lot of recommendations, including that AMR should be on the risk register. Now, part of the secret of getting evidence into policy, I would argue, and it'll be very interesting to get the feedback from former cabinet secretary, former ministers and civil servants who are here, is if you're in the room, you can make the point. Plus, it's something about timing. So there were all sorts of things I cared about and wanted to say, but if the timing wasn't right, then there was no point in saying it because it wasn't going to be heard. So there's something about timing, being in the room, and since I was a child, the water on the stone technique has been successful. Unfortunately, I have a daughter who's even better at it than me, but that's another story. So I was particularly lucky with this, and I'm going to come back to that. But let's just think a bit about antimicrobial resistance. Fleming discovered penicillin. By the time he got to his Nobel Prize presentation, he was talking about the natural development of resistance to antibiotics, penicillin in particular, and the fact it would cause deaths. So we knew from the man it would happen. The Surgeon General in the States is credited, well, he did say, the time has come to close the book on infectious diseases. Some people would argue, historians, that this is misinterpreted. It certainly is wrong when you think that most liver cancer is caused by hepatitis C, most cervical cancer is caused by papillomavirus. So many inflammatory diseases are probably caused by alterations in our bacteria of the microbiome. So we now know that what a lot of people call non-communicable diseases actually start with infections, communicable diseases. I think, but I'm writing a book on that, we need to change how we do some of this. So what happens with resistance? You don't have to look at this, it's just to remind me to explain that it's natural selection. A mutation happens, that bug becomes resistant to the antibiotic, so it can multiply. The problem that makes it even worse, they do multiply bacteria, for instance, every 20 minutes, so it's quite easy, is that they're really friendly. And a lot of these genes are on little bits of circular DNA called plasmids, and they kind of put out a proboscis and flip that plasmid into their friends, aunts, uncles, cousins, who can then pass it on to their children. Or they drop it into the plasma or the other fluid, and it gets sucked up by one and passed on to their progeny. So it kind of travels rather fast. And bacteria are clever. And we have this horizontal. So no surprises that I was rather concerned by what I heard then and about the hidden and escalating threat. And if you look, we began to get resistance in staph. 55 in Japan, they had this really nasty dysentery, misspelt, but I'm dyslexic. TB gave us a global health emergency, and on it goes. Indeed, at the moment, there's diphtheria in Pakistan, in Lahore, what started in Hyderabad, is resistant, and 40% of the children are dying of it, when it should be 4% that die if we had effective antibiotics. I mean, this is catastrophic, if you think about it that way. And then the other thing that they told me, I had already known this, but it's quite important to the story, is, of course, that we've got an empty pipeline. When I was a young doctor and we found a patient had a resistant bug, the microbiologist said, never mind, Sally, open the cupboard and get the next one out, and the patient got better. But people stopped investing. And so it's an empty pipeline because we have a market failure. They stopped investing because antibiotics are really cheap. I mean, if I happen to be in France and I really need some, of course, only when I know I've got a bacteria because viruses don't respond, I just go and buy them and, you know, I think last time it was £6 for a course of antibiotics. They are really cheap. And most people don't even have one course in a year. So think about anti-blood pressure tablets or anti-diabetes treatments. You only need to make a tiny amount on each treatment. But people are having them forever, and millions of people are having them. There is not a market. There's a market failure. And in the latest work from the WHO, they reckon there are 51 new antibiotics and biologicals in clinical development. Only 8 are classified as innovative. And we get a very high failure rate when they come through into the clinic. And my experts have explained this to me, that if you're trying to just alter one receptor on a cell for blood pressure or diabetes, you need a low amount of the drug. But when you're trying to kill bugs, you have to put a high amount of the drug into the blood or the tissue, and then it's more likely to lead to toxicity. So I think I can understand that. But it's even more complex. As I started on this journey about this and lifted up stones, I couldn't believe what I found out. So we've been talking about humans. But did you know that in most fish farming, and remember that fish protein is the one that's growing fastest to feed our growing population, they just tip antibiotics in with the feed. I have pictures of dirty seawater. And animals, humans, beef, chickens, fish, pee out about 80–90% of antibiotics into the environment. So we're damaging our environment. It's going into the sewage. Saudi, we were talking about Saudi earlier, Creon, I understand, spray their dates. It's the citrus fruits of Florida and California that spray them with streptomycin. Saudi injects antibiotics into the date palms. So they're being used profligately. They get into the wildlife. If I'd done this, it would say pets rather than the politically correct companion animals, but they get antibiotics like everyone else, let alone the food animals. Now, since 2006, Europe has had a law that we can't use antibiotics for growth promotion. Over 70% of antibiotics used in the world are for animals. Over 70% of that is not for treating ill animals. It's for growth promotion and disease prevention. It's much cheaper than cleanliness, you know, to use antibiotics. And then the minute you've produced nasty bugs on your food animals, you can get it into the food chain, and hey, it goes on. I could go on at long length. This is complex, and it's what we call one system. And once you've got AMR, it flows around the system. So here are 2. Start with the New Delhi one, which started in New Delhi and is now known as NDM1 because we don't want to call them something nasty. And that happened to shift round the world in the space of 2 years, found everywhere. The other one here, KPCs, in the space of 5 years was spread all around the world. And the big example at the moment is colistin, which was found in China by some British researchers in March 2015. Colistin's a horrible antibiotic. It's a last resort one that we wouldn't want to use, but it saves lives, so you need it. And hey, by 2017, 2 years later, it was in 17 countries, and it's probably wider. So, back to policy. Having published my report, with a lot of recommendations, I mean, particularly as I was new, it could have sat there, but I was particularly lucky that we had a minister without portfolio who read it and called me in with a number of officials to discuss it, so we talked about it, and then he said, do we have, at least this is my version, you can correct me, Oliver, if I'm getting it wrong, do we have a strategy? And I said, yes, the government's about to publish a strategy for it. And he said, do you think the strategy answers your concerns in your report? And I looked at these very nice officials and thought hard about what I was going to say and said, no, it's wet. So he turned around and said, go away, come back in 6 weeks with a strategy that addresses those issues so that we can put it out, which we did, and I'll come back to that strategy. You need, if you want to make a difference, the politicians to read it or to think about it and to be on your side. The next move I made, and he was very important to this, was the cabinet secretary. So I would have dinner regularly with the cabinet secretary to tell him what I was up to and ask his advice. And Jeremy Haywood said, so what's really bothering you? And I said, AMR, and I explained. And he said, so what do you want to do? And I said, well, I've looked at climate change, and that is equally complex. And what made a difference in climate change was having Nick Stern, as an economist, look at the economic impact. So I want us to do the same. Will the Prime Minister commission something? So we had a debate, and he sent me home and said, I want one side of A4 by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning on this. I wished I hadn't drunk the half bottle of wine. And docs are not great. At least I wasn't at the beginning. I'm now quite good at writing briefings, but I went and wrote it. It was on his desk at 9 o'clock. I was called in to see the Prime Minister a week later, and I knew that Jeremy Haywood, the Cabinet Secretary, had set it up for success because he walked in, various senior advisors walked in. They wouldn't have done if I was being, got rid of politely. And instead of 20 minutes, I had 40 minutes and explained about bugs, antimicrobial resistance, and what I wanted. And David Cameron was fantastic and commissioned, and we set out to find the right person. And we persuaded Jim O'Neill, who, like Lord Stern, became a Lord as a result of his economic review. So if you want to go into the House of Lords, find an important, complex subject, do the economic impact, and maybe it'll work. And it's great. So what did he do? He went off to sit in the Wellcome Trust with a team that we found him, led by a wonderful woman on loan from the Treasury and some other civil servants, and worked with various consultants to look at this problem. And this is one of his early figures, which it had impact all around the world. I mean, Jim and I did go around the world with all of this too, to make sure everyone knew about it. We had great fun, particularly going to Brazil, because, of course, he was the one that described bricks. So they thought he was a god and listened to every word. And that meant they supported us in the global fora. So in blue, what you see is the estimated deaths at the moment. Purple is what the estimated deaths on a few of the nasty bugs that have resistance at the moment, by no means all, would do by 2050. And he was convinced that this is a dreadful problem, that we cannot afford not to take action, and that actually, for his mind, just shows if you come from banking, you have a different perspective from the public sector, it would be cheap to sort. So, look at where it is. It will occur particularly in the low and middle income countries, and the Russian big blob or around there is particularly related to TB. Did you know that over 200,000 people die every year from multi-drug and extreme drug-resistant TB? But what about the poor babies in India? 60,000 newborns dying of sepsis that's resistant to first-line drugs. Now, I should just make a few extra comments here. There are more people who die because they don't get antibiotics than of resistance at the moment, but that will cross over. I see the microbiologist in the audience nodding. That's a very important thing to recognize. And, of course, we have resistance in all bugs, not just bacteria, but first-line HIV, 7% at least are resistant to first-line drugs. TB, malaria resistance means that we're now using combinations of drugs, and we're beginning to see resistance to that. all infective organisms develop resistance and we have problems. Fungi is a big problem these days. So we have to worry about that. So you'd think we'd done the definitive study, we could move on. So some academics stood up and said, yeah, but this isn't a very good study. I mean, you haven't done it in detail enough, so they nitpicked. We weren't trying to be perfect academics. We were trying to move the subject forward. The World Bank, in particular, took exception to this and said they didn't believe it. So I persuaded DFID and their equivalent in Sweden and the Netherlands to fund them to do a study. Funny, they got the same sort of results. But what they also showed was they couldn't work out how bad it would be in 50 years. So they did a low scenario and a high scenario. Whichever way you look at it, it's going to cause more people being moved into poverty. And they calculated by 2050, an extra 28 million people would be moved into poverty. So by their very set-up definitions, they have to work on it. And that it was going to be particularly bad for the low-income countries. People thought we were all over-egging it. It's very interesting that in September, the Canadians did a big piece of work. And at the moment, they've got 26% resistance to first-line drugs, and they modelled moderate resistance, that it goes up to 40%, and total resistance up to 100%. And hey, look what it does to your GDP. But they also showed that at the moment, it's already reducing their GDP by 2 billion Canadian dollars in 2018, reducing the economy by 0.13%, which is the equivalent of their motor vehicle manufacturing industry. Now, you might say it's a good thing to stop the global warming, but that's quite a significant thing. And it's really important because what they did, they focused on labour supply, that households contribute to industries, so there's more goods and services, and then that they can buy those back. But if they're not in work, they've got less income, so the economy shrinks. The economists will get all of that. So there we were with quite a lot of data back in developing, and I think this on the left puts it beautifully, that Jim, with his team, showed that we would end up with one death every 3 seconds if we didn't take action. One of the other things he did, which was terribly important, was get everyone focused on, actually, we don't really know enough about what's going on. We need to put in place across the world really good surveillance and monitoring. And that's why I've chosen the right-hand one. So in summary, we've got a big problem. It's crept up on us. It's a bit like the lobster. If you put it in cold water, people don't notice it. The lobster's not supposed to notice it. And the crackling of the lobster as it gets hot is not pain. We don't measure it properly, and we've got inadequate action. And if we don't do something, one person every 3 seconds will die. So I am apt to say, and I mean it, though it may not sound like that we're more likely to die of AMR than climate change, because this could catch us first. So let's look at some of the data we've got that I've been sharing with ministers as we move forward, and then I'll show you some of the things we've been doing. So this shows you how, on the top left, how antibiotic use has been rising. Now, antibiotic use is needed to treat infections, prevent infections, but actually it's therefore a marker of development. So perhaps it's not surprising that the bricks are, in the darker colours, really increasing their amount. Australia? A bit worrying, isn't it? And then look, in the bottom right one, how using antibiotics and the use is related to resistance. You actually don't want to get an infection in Greece or India at the moment, or quite a lot of other places, really. And South Africa, for instance, has increased its antibiotic use by 220%. It is really very worrying. And you look at the use, and you can see that the best places are generally the Scandinavian and the Netherlands. Now, look at animal use. And this is just consumption. I talked about intensive animal raising and the spillovers that can happen, but more antibiotics are used in poultry, swine and cattle to promote growth than to prevent and treat disease in humans, that entire human population. That does feel wrong. Look at England. I was a CMO for England, an advisor to the UK government. Isn't it interesting that you see such variation? Darker is higher. And there doesn't seem to be any obvious relationship with the clinical outcomes or problems. In fact, in 2016, the lowest rate was in Lancashire, while the highest was just up the road in Merseyside, which was almost double the level. So that is quite interesting, that we don't really know too much about what's going on, and we begin to see that. Indeed, there's also other quite interesting work showing a direct relationship between number of courses of antibiotics in infancy and overweight and obesity as you get older. Presumably, if you can give antibiotics to beef and chickens and pigs to make them grow better, you can give them to other animals called humans and they'll grow better. And it's probably mediated by altering their microbiome. So it all kind of fits together. Variations in prescribing are not unique to Britain, of course. This is a ghastly picture. I don't think I'll go further than that. So, what should governments do? Well, clearly, we have a very serious and growing problem, and it needed political action. And I was lucky it was taken up by our minister I've forgotten what special minister anyway. Sorry, Oliver, I've forgotten your title there. And my Secretary of State, who was very supportive, and we managed to get it into the government's risk register next to terrorism and pandemic flu. Everyone said, you won't get that. I said, yes, we will. We'll do the modelling. And we got it in there. We got it in the Department of Health. We got it in DEFRAs, so that it became apolitical. It was great they supported it, but if Labour were to get in, they would have to support it too, because it was in the risk register, and this is fact-based. But we still need to get awareness across the whole system, everyone. We need to make sure we use them well, and it's about access, not excess. We've got to prevent infections, and that takes you back to vaccination. We need to know what's going on, and clearly we want lots of innovation, better ways to do all of that, innovation in the behavioural and the social sciences, new antibiotics, new diagnostic tests. But it is a bit difficult when people don't really understand why you're taking antibiotics. I don't think the Wellcome Trust asked women. I think they only asked men, but, you know, why not use men? So they recognise, at least a third of them do, that antibiotics not working is an important threat to our health. But actually, 2/3 of them thought that antibiotics might treat viruses, when of course they don't. They treat bacteria. You need antivirals to treat viruses, and they're in short supply, not because we can't buy enough of them, but because we haven't been able to find good ones in general. And what you also need is public buy-in. I know you can have the evidence, and you can have a minister who wants to do it, but they can't move if it's going to be politically unacceptable at the voting box. They have to be able to take the public with them. And the classic example is, of course, tobacco that took 50 years to get there. So we did eventually produce a good strategy, and I'll come back to the one from last year. Again, in a minute or two. We set out to improve knowledge, conserve and look after what we've got, and stimulate the development of it. And my report had really set off cross-government work. There was another occasion where I was starting on our international campaign, and I went back to the Cabinet Secretary and said, I need some help. How do I do the international bit? He said, you need a campaign. I said, I'd never thought of myself in that way. I thought about evidence and science. No, campaign. You go and see the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office. Now, I wasn't told how to approach the permanent secretary, so off I go and get a nice cup of coffee in this beautiful office. I had a nice one. This was 3 times bigger and nicer. And I said, I've come back. The cabinet secretary said you could help me. So he said, what on? So I explained about AMR. And then there was a long silence. And I'm quite good at silence if I need to be. So I thought, right, I'll sit this out. Eventually he said, you need a campaign. And I said, yes. More silence. And then he said, we can do that. And I said, oh, good. I knew you could. How do you do it? So then the Foreign Office came on board, and as I used to tease all the diplomats around the world, of course it was great working on AMR because it mattered. They were saving lives, not some political whim which they might not be signed up to. And then we got DFID on board, and DEFRA helped a bit. And good progress, and I'll come back to the latest strategy in a minute. It took a lot of collaboration. I have learnt tricks I never thought I had. As a scientist, you want to publish and you want to be first or last author. No, I have to give it away so other people own it and are proud of having made it happen. They're all there. They've done a wonderful job. I'm proud of what they've made happen. They are fantastic. And without all of this lot, we wouldn't have achieved what we've achieved, and it isn't anywhere near enough. You might die. And more importantly, this is an intergenerational problem. We've used the antibiotics. What are we giving to our children and our grandchildren? It does sit on the risk register. We had a wonderful fun because my predecessor, but one at Trinity, Lord Rees, persuaded Innovate UK and Nesta to set up a prize, a Longitude Prize. And I said, oh, we could have in the Longitude Prize a rapid diagnostic. But I didn't realise it wasn't the strength of the case that was going to decide what should be done. It was the public voting. I got every network I know to vote, and I discovered you could vote 3 times. So guess what? The Longitude Prize was for diagnostics in AMR. I'm nothing if not persistent. We've done lots of things, and Public Health England have been very good. We decided we wanted a campaign on television and press about don't use antibiotics if you don't need them. So they did some really interesting focus groups, and they discovered this is in Liverpool, so you might be different, but I bet you're not. That people wanted antibiotics to validate they were ill. So they'd wanted to be able to ring up their family or their work and say, I'm ill, I got a prescription for an antibiotic. So they made these wonderful pads at the bottom so you can go and you can be told you're ill, it's ticked, you're told what to do, you're told how long to have off, you can be validated. Really nice social science. Lots of very good guidelines, and actually it's having an impact. Just look at the top left panel, which is on humans, and how we've brought down prescribing. Indeed, one of the ways we did that Public Health England thought up was for, I think it's happened 4 years now, I have written to, starting with randomised half of the top 20% of GP prescribers saying you're in the top half, you might want to know. I mean, the top 20%, I do always get a few letters saying you don't understand what it's like to be a GP and how difficult and everything, and I write back and say, no, I don't, you're right, but you still prescribe more than others. Brought it down by 3% year on year. It is just amazing, some of the things we can do. One of the things, though, that I was really interested in was the vets decided to work with the private sector in the food chain and reduce inappropriate use of antibiotics voluntarily. I think they were told that if they didn't, I would persuade government to make it mandatory. And you see, I'm seen as the witch sometimes. That's all right if it gets the right result. And they have reduced antibiotics by 53% since 2014 in the animal sector. That's significant. One of the ways is in fish farming, that only for salmon and trout, there is a mixture of 3 vaccines that you can see me giving a poor little salmon. Yes, I'm holding the little salmon. And you can see how antibiotics have come down in Norway and the same in Scotland. They're the same owners, that's why. And protein goes up. So we need more vaccines in fish farming. And the Norwegians have developed a robot that now vaccinates them instead of the English CMO. I mentioned a public policy campaign. Many of you will have seen the dancing antibiotics saying, look after us, don't use us, because if you don't need them, because if you do, we might not work when you want us. So, trying to come to an end. January last year, our new Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, launched our new vision. We'd had a 5-year plan, we'd moved into the next stage, and when we sat down 18 months before to debate cross-government what we should do, it was quite clear we needed an apolitical vision, where were we trying to go, and then a plan. And it's what you'd expect. We're going to work with, well, everyone, because you have to. There is no way around this. Everyone's needed. But the plan sets out 3 main headings, and then 15 content areas and 100 commitments. It is tough. And while I was still there, my successor chairs the government committee that brings it all back and checks that people are delivering. And as the special envoy for the government, I'm asking for reports to check that it's happening, because you can't give up. If you do, things fall out. But there are some rather good targets, if we could only deliver them, like halving healthcare-associated gram-negative infections. Unfortunately, they've been creeping up, but we have to hope we will get there. So, to just show you some other things that came out of that first plan and Jim O'Neill's work with us, this NAP stands for National Action Plan. Ours is a National Action Plan. I persuaded Treasury and DFID to give us 265 million of official development assistance to help with surveillance around the world, because we can't sit and be an island. This comes and goes. A wonderful Swedish study of backpacking people. They went with clean microbiomes. They came back, and I think it was 20 out of 22 had resistant bugs in their poo, in their microbiome. We pick them up, we take them round, they travel. So we have to help everyone else. And this is Britain's soft power as well. This is global Britain for you. And data's at the heart of this programme, and it's really very exciting. We're working with 24 countries, and indeed, Cambridge is leading one of those programmes, a partnership through the Commonwealth of pharmacists, and some of our NHS pharmacists are going to Kenya and places, and they come back here. Both sides learn, as I know from when I was sent on an exchange to eastern Nigeria and learnt a lot. I've never forgotten trying to see patients walking through the bush in eastern Nigeria. Luckily, I was in trainers, with someone ringing a bell, a bit like a town crier, saying, there's a doctor here, why don't you come out of the bush and see her? It was tragic. We also have, thanks to Jim O'Neill, because he became a minister at the Treasury, a global AMR innovation fund. It's got 7 work packages. Some of it's bilateral partnerships. Again, soft power, but using AMR and forwarding AMR, working with China. They're investing 20 million. We're investing 20 million. Working with Argentina. Global initiatives where research competitions are needed. One Health. But back to government. We've had to do a lot on global policy making. We've worked with what's called the tripartite, the WHO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and Organization for Animal Health. DFID provides the ambassador to FAO. Foreign Office provide our ambassador to the WHO. We all work as a team. Sometimes I have to whiz over and see people. We work out of Paris Embassy with OIE. We've worked with the Environment Programme, but they're much more difficult to engage. Our Sherpas have been wonderful working with G20 as a forum for a global mechanism to reactivate the antibiotic pipeline, and David Cameron and then Theresa May made sure that they mentioned or talked about and mentioned AMR. I'm hoping our new PM will do it. Argentinian G20, it was an 18-hour trip to Argentina because of flight problems, and I ran a simulation of an AMR outbreak going out of control, ruining their tourism, their economy, their crop production and their health service. And all the health ministers joined in. It was just such fun, and they really learned a lot. We work with the EU, who do a wonderful job in AMR, and we have an excellent partnership on it, and on the Global Health Security Agenda with 59 countries. So you can see it's all working with people. The ambassadors of a number of countries in New York come together with our ambassador. At the time, it was Matthew Rycroft. Our present ambassador is just moving on to, has continued it and is moving on to Washington, with ministers of health in Geneva. So we keep bringing people together, raising it up. And the UN Secretary General set up an interagency coordination group for AMR following a big meeting at the UN. And I was asked to be co-convener and was supported by teams from across government. So we engage across the world. We engage with the private sector, not just pharma, but farmers as well, with stakeholders everywhere. And we try and make a difference. Indeed, I published in 2013. In 2014, we had a resolution at the WHO, which we couldn't have done without ministerial and political support. We had a global action plan there at WHO, at FAO and OIE in 2015. And in 2016, we went to the UN and had all the countries there signing off on a political declaration. What was interesting there was they'd only had 3 previous health meetings. HIV, non-communicable diseases, which you now know from me are not all non-communicable, and Ebola. And I kept meeting people who would say, where are the patients? How did this end up here? And we'd say, well, we did it. We need it. Oh, technical pull. How can you do it as a technical pull? So there you are. Scientists can make a difference. Technical pull. And they set up this interagency coordination group, and the Deputy Secretary General's been particularly supportive and helpful. We handed over our report in April last year, and we had a number of recommendations. I'm not going to go into them, but accelerating progress, innovating, collaborating, investing, but particularly accountability and global governance, which are priority recommendations for us in this country, because we don't believe we're going to crack this if people don't accept accountability. And we have to get that to happen. We'd like an IPCC-type mechanism for the science. We want a kind of advocacy leaders group. And we also want the investors to use an AMR lens. So, World Bank and reconstruction banks use a gender lens or a climate change lens. I make an investment. It must not make these things worse, and can it make them better? They can do the same for AMR. It's about preventing infection. It's about infection control. It's about isolation, topical at the moment. So we work with everyone. The private sector, food chain, pharma, buildings. How do you design buildings to prevent infection? Importantly, I can't remember the number, 85 companies, 9 industry associations from 18 different companies came together to make a declaration that they would move forward in a One Health approach and do things, and that's very important. But we aren't where we need to be yet. We're still pushing to get things to happen, and I do believe that data is at the basis of it. So evidence, the bit that can move mountains, is data. But we're only going to really move things forward if we can try interventions and then evaluate them as we go, or monitor the impact and show that they work. That's terrifically important. And we're not where we need to be, so this is a really sad story. This is Achaogen. Small biotech given BARDA, which is US government funding, of 124 million targeting resistant enterobacteriaceae. I always have problems with these names. And then they got approval for complicated urine infections, but not for the broader bit that they wanted, which was bloodstream infections. Having got approval, and you can see when that happened, it was just when the stock started to really tumble, they had to get rid of their R&D staff and get sales staff. And it went bust. And the sales were disappointing because hospitals didn't want to, in the States, didn't want to buy a drug that they weren't used to, that was a bit more expensive. Yet, it was a really good drug. We needed it. Luckily, it's been bought by Cipla, which is an interesting generic. In India, some of you will know Yusuf Hamid. He's a Cambridge chemistry graduate who actually does care about this sort of thing, so I think it may come back. But there are a number, I'm told, 15 or 16 little SMEs who've got potentially useful drugs that look as if they're going bust the same way. And we've put a lot of money, particularly the States, but us and some other people, into the basic research and finding possibilities. But you've got to do the clinical trials, go through regulation, manufacture, and then supply. And it really is very difficult. It's very difficult even to make this happen for poor countries for the present drugs that are there. Remember the access issue. What is it that Coca-Cola does that they can get their drug everywhere cheaply and we can't get antibiotics of high quality in proper doses to where they need to be? And we've got to work on making it attractive to pull through antibiotics. And the best hope in the world at the moment is a project that we've launched, which is working between industry and NICE around how do you value antibiotics, value them in a much more global way in the NHS. So there you are, an economics project that we're doing. And they're trying to forecast the value of health benefits, and it won't be a one-size-fits-all, and they will be having 2 drugs, antibiotics in there to predict. So this is a long journey, and sadly, it's not over. So I can't spend 7 days a week in Cambridge. I'm spending 1 day a week in London and travelling too. We have just at Davos launched not only an access to medicines benchmark set of data on pharma and what they're doing, and they seem to have gone backward over the last year, but also with Jeremy Collar, who funds an NGO called FAIR, we've kicked off a new effort which is making this year the year of investor action on AMR. Because if we can't do it through politics, how do you make something happen? You get at consumers and you get at the investors. If they won't invest in meat production where antibiotics are abused, then it won't happen. It was fantastic when McDonald's said they were not going to have chickens by the end of this year that had had antibiotics for growth promotion. Unfortunately, they changed their minds when some polling showed that climate change might matter more. But it impacted them in their bottom line while they were talking about it. You can really change the world through consumers and investors. So we're trying that, as well as with politicians around the world and the public. So I hope that gives you some feel for all of this getting science to policy. A lot of it is about relationships. It's about trust. It's about helping others to see their dreams come true. And these are the dreams of our children that we need to make come through. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes for questions, which Sally Davies has kindly agreed to take. We've got a roving mic, so if you please wait for a microphone. And yeah, can we take one here, please, first? And we'll take them one at a time at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you first for a wonderful talk. Karen Struban, Royal Society of Chemistry. I had a question. So you started by talking about the fact that researchers already had the evidence that AMR was getting worse, but they weren't really getting it on the political agenda. And you've referred also to the fact that it's really important to get public buy-in. And this kind of makes me also think of a previous lecture I attended with CSaP with Johannes Vogel, where there was discussion around whether a 16-year-old girl should be the one bringing climate change, the other problem you've compared it with, to the political and public agenda. And it seems in this case you've been instrumental in actually doing that. So the question is, at the one hand, is there a bigger role for scientists to learn or to become better at bringing things where they have the evidence to the political agenda? But also you touched on the difficulty of prioritizing within government and for ministers. So also from the other side, what have you learned and what are your insights in how this prioritization of evidence could become easier or could be better? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it'll never be easy for politicians. Everything's vying for attention. So they often listen to their own constituency people. They listen to charities who are arguing on behalf of groups or of patients and everything. And they read the newspapers avidly. So, you know, are you getting the stories and everything there? Can you make the case? And have you got the chief scientific advisor in the appropriate department on your side? So there are all sorts of different ways. I mean, my husband always laughs and says that what nobody understood, least of all me probably, was I was a campaigner who ended up in government rather than someone who was there and then learned how to campaign.
Thank you for the splendid update. In talking about sustainability, continue to say that I think that antimicrobial resistance is the greatest problem for humans in the world at the moment. The question is, how are we going? We are going to need a lot of further antibiotics to replace the ones which are not working. Is there an adequate mechanism in the world to get enough new antimicrobials? Is the situation where drug production is in the hands of commercial pharma companies going to work in the long run? I don't see that it's working very well at the moment. Is it going to work in the future? You flagged it up at the beginning.
So we have a broken system at the moment, broken in many ways. We rely generally on India and China's generic industries for the standard antibiotics. They've, because we don't pay much for them, all consolidated. So a factory burnt down 2 years ago in China that made Pip-Taz. I'm a hematologist. We use Pip-Taz to save the lives of leukemics. It costs the NHS 30 million, that 18-month stock out, because the one other producing factory didn't produce enough. There are places in the world that can't get penicillin G, which is a standard penicillin that should be available everywhere. So what are they using? They're using much more complex antibiotics that they shouldn't use unless the first line didn't work. Meanwhile, the contamination of the environment from some of these factories making the active pharmaceutical ingredient, predominantly in China, a bit in India, making the antibiotics, China and India, is horrendous. And one of my colleagues in Sweden measures the water coming out of factories, and the amount lost from factories of antibiotics is awful. And then it goes into the water table and out into the oceans and will stimulate more resistance as well. So we've got a number of problems coming together. A lot of those factories are quite old. Should we be building factories in the West? Should we be building drug factories here, much more roboticized, make the investment but know that we have a resilient chain that is not contaminating our environment and everything. And I would think that what's going on in China will stimulate more of that sort of discussion around where do you do your manufacturing over the coming months or years. So there's all of those complexities with how do you stimulate people to make novel antibiotics and then pull them through. And interestingly, our little project with NICE and the Health Technology Assessment is being watched by the whole world because we are the only people who are really trying to address this and look at a different way, except for some behind the curtains discussions about can a fund be set up to drag stuff through, which may come to fruition, but I think it's 50-50. So I do worry about it. On a bad night, I think about it in the middle of the night.
David Cleveley, one of the investors in one of those 15 SMEs that you were talking about. I know exactly, it's been a very long journey. It may not quite be over yet, but nothing like the sunlit uplands that I thought it would be even 10 years ago. So I've got two questions really, or two parts of questions really. One is, in the long run, does it mean that we cannot stop antimicrobial resistance? Because if this is an evolutionary race, that's it.
Correct.
Right. Thank you for that optimistic update. And the second one is that human beings seem to be remarkably optimistic about this stuff. Is it actually what's driving us is a fundamental belief that technology will somehow solve this, and that we will accept a few million deaths and then somebody will put some money into it and crack the problem for some reasonable period of time, and that's what we're putting our faith in?
I think some people think that, but others, I mean, I'm not an economist, but it's discounting the longer, they take the short-term gain for the long-term loss and discount without really understanding what they're doing. I don't think we have yet succeeded in getting people to understand what this really means. I mean, I saw a few years ago a picture of a little girl with her face totally distorted with infection, and she was the first child to be treated with penicillin, and the infection was cutting off her airway, and penicillin saved her. I mean, we risk going back to that sort of thing, but people they haven't seen it, they don't understand it. I mean, HIV, the only good thing, well, maybe there were other good things that I don't know, that came out of it was actually suddenly people woke up to, oh, so doctors can't treat everything. It is worrying. People think we can find a way around it, and we can't always. We have at least 2,000 deaths a year of infection, resistant infections in England, at least.
Thank you. Fiona Reynolds, you've talked a lot about the climate change challenge alongside, and clearly we have to try to address both. Are there synergies between them? I mean, I could see a lot of what you were saying about sustainable food production might be a big thing, but what about people's own attitude to their own health, living healthier lifestyles? Would those things help?
Well, they probably would. I mean, I worry about climate change, of course we all do, but things like as it gets warmer, malaria will spread more, water will be in shorter supply and be therefore easier to contaminate because it'll be more concentrated. But some of the solutions for that will help us. I have great hope in Bill Gates' waterless loos, and he's got about 3 technologies going, but they all result in destruction of the pee and poo, so the bugs will be destroyed, as well as saving water. So the innovation that comes may help us, but yes, they are inextricably linked in different ways, and providing a healthy, sustainable food chain needs to be part of both solutions.
Charlie Kennel, University of California, San Diego. I would be curious to know your views on what the principal issues to be taken up by the IPCC for antibiotic microbial resistance, AMR.
Well, at the moment, people do research in different areas. No one brings it all together and says, so what does this mean? Plus, the research had almost died out. It's beginning to come back again. But if you put it together, you'll not only will get great insights, but we'll see that we're not putting enough into research and into data. And then, of course, the other thing that happens is if you do that, you get a wonderful media moment with a focus where you can get some political and consumer interest. So I think it has every advantage. I think we'll get one. It'll be a bit watered down on the IPCC because that's so very expensive. But it is a tragedy that we handed in the report in April. The Secretary-General asked the WHO and the others to make things happen by the summer or the end of September, and we still haven't got any of it. My views are perfectly clear.
It's very impressive what you've done with Coalition to stop overuse, but are you limited by just the economic incentives on people to overuse bacteria because they can make more money out of livestock? I mean, do you need some big economic lever that, like a carbon tax equivalent to, just drive everybody to the other way?
Well, that may be part of the answer. In practice, once you make the investment in hygiene, it's not so terribly expensive. They call it biosecurity in that sector, but it is hygiene. But it's making that investment, and we need World Bank and Asian Development Bank and everyone to be prepared to make loans based on that. And we're going to have to pay, possibly, a bit more for our meat. But as we know that most meat eaters eat far too much meat, and it would then go further, hurrah, we'll have a healthier public. I'm very happy about that.
It's Susan Owens. Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Evidence moves mountains, you said. I think the experience is that evidence sometimes moves mountains, but it often does it rather slowly, and it depends on the obstacles in the way. Are there any interests that are actually against doing something about antimicrobial resistance? Or is it a case of making gradual progress and dealing with some of the kinds of obstacles that we understand we can do something about? So is there an equivalent of the climate change skeptics and deniers and the immensely powerful interests that can simply use brute power to get in the way of doing something about this issue, or doing enough about this issue?
A super question, and that's why I'm working with Jeremy Collar and investors on a big investor year of action, because clearly the food interest is in producing more meat cheaper rather than the animal welfare and things. But as you played back to me, evidence moves mountains, there was something I wanted to say, that I have sat in many meetings between politicians and academics, and I think as a tribe, I'm now claiming to be an academic since I came here. I do have a history. As a tribe, we're not good at two things. One is listening to the politicians. What is the problem that they're trying to solve? And the second is framing the subject so that it becomes salient to them. So the obesity bit I'll pick up. I was doing a report on obesity, and St. Thomas's, guys in St. Thomas's Trust had done a piece of work with the Frameworks Institute. And what they had found, and it's very nice work, was that, and I knew it from talking to politicians, that politicians were bored with hearing about childhood obesity because it was an epidemic and it was so big it was just unsortable. And that we therefore had to frame it, that it was solvable, not talk about an epidemic, and start to frame it differently. So what they advised me to do, and I think I bought into it, I don't know whether Teresa did, we were talking about it the other day, but to talk about children being in a flood of unhealthy food Well, we can dam floods. We can reduce floods. Unhealthy food and drink, being in the spotlight. Well, you can turn the spotlight off and you can move them out. So giving them a different way of thinking about it by the way you talk about it. And I think academics are not very good at thinking about, at listening and thinking, what are the politicians trying to do? How can I help them? And I'm a problem solver, and that was one reason I was quite good at my job. And the other is, framing. Are you framing it so they are interested and will listen to you?
Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that the innovative strategies of the government would be to create new antibiotics, but would it not be more financially beneficial to invest in alternatives such as phage therapy?
So, phage is likely to play a role. There's a very famous patient whose wife saved his life by finding the right phage. The trouble is, every bug needs its own phage. I mean, apparently if you go looking in poo and rivers and places, you find masses of phage, but you've got to find the phage that goes with the bug. So you could imagine before you went into hospital, well, not you, I could imagine before I go into hospital and have a new hip that I might drink a cocktail of phage for the common strains of E. coli, for instance. You could imagine that we could have banks and banks of phage, and actually in the States, because this woman was so very successful, not only in saving her husband's life, and there's a rather wonderful book about it, but also in raising the awareness that we will have banks and banks of it. But it's quite complex, it's not as easy. Other people are looking at, can we have antibodies to alter the immune system when people either might get infections or have got them, and they may well play a role. Other people are looking at how bugs talk to each other. Can you stop them doing things by... So there will be other ways of doing it, but hey, we know antibiotics work, so can I have some of those while we play with the other things?
You mentioned one of the problems to solving AMR is the belief that people have that we will somehow solve it and science can fix everything, so we don't need to do anything. How do we encourage an environment of innovation where people try and solve these problems and we want to make people think they can solve these problems without creating the expectation that it's easy and it'll just happen?
Well, I think the problem is that we've got SMEs who are beginning to try, but then they're going broke and we're not pulling them through. So if we could sort the market failure, we would be part of the way.
Thank you.
Sally, you showed that the major problem was in the developing economies around the world, but do you not consider it might also get a bigger problem in the developed economies as we have an aging population, because we know in aging our ability to deal with infections declines as the immune system declines. So actually maybe it can become far more serious in these countries than India.
You're right. I could have shown you the detailed data we've got showing that infections and resistant infections are not going down, and it is the case mix, and it, despite lots of efforts from our nurses and doctors, nurses are wonderful at this, and it's probably aging demographic that makes it happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Final question.
Teresa Marte, thank you so much, Sally. You've told a great story where evidence and the evidence communicator are the heroes, and the doors open with a certain amount of help. Could you share with us in this very personal space, now that you're no longer CMO, where you felt you had really compelling evidence, but somehow the doors didn't open?
Obesity.
I think that is, in fact, an invitation for continuing the conversation over in the reception. So, 3 things. I'd like to invite you to join Sally in the reception afterwards. That's 1. 2, if you like this, sign up to our annual conference. That's the second invitation, our annual conference on the 17th of June at the Royal Society. Third invitation is the most important, which is to join me in thanking Sally for a really outstanding lecture.